So there's a growing number of people who have almost casually said that they expect AGI, artificial general intelligence, to automate so many jobs that we're going to need some kind of UBI.
A universal basic income.
So I certainly believe in universal basic income. I don't think that's enough, though.
It is not enough to just give people a universal basic income.
It won't be a case of universal basic income. It'll be a case of universal high income is the most likely outcome.
So here, I'm not going to discuss the likelihood of this future scenario, or indeed the pros and cons of UBI, but instead I want to focus on how the economics of UBI could actually work. In particular, I'm going to explore how the ideas of MMT, modern monetary theory, might help us develop answers to that question. So first, what is MMT? At its core, modern monetary theory is just a description of how fiat currencies actually work in high-income countries that issue their own currency, countries like America, Britain and Japan. But what is interesting about MMT is how it stands in opposition to the familiar analogy used by many politicians, who like to suggest that government finances are like a household budget. In particular, that governments have to tax or borrow money from the economy before they can spend it. Now, in this video, I'm going to try out a new analogy. A traditional analogy for describing the flow of money within an economy is to talk about money as water flowing through pipes into storage tanks or buckets or baths. But unlike money or wealth, water naturally flattens out to be equally distributed. So I've been wondering whether a better analogy would be to think of money as sand, with the whole economy being a sandpit or sandbox, where some children have collected together large piles of sand, leaving other areas of the sandpit relatively barren. The traditional household budgeting view of government finances says that if you want to add some sand in a corner that is looking rather empty, then you have to first scoop up some sand from one of the piles through taxation or borrowing, and only then can you spend it where you want to add some sand. Seems pretty intuitive, yeah? Well, MMT advocates point out that, actually, governments who issue a currency effectively have a sand-making machine. So they can simply create new sand, create money, and sprinkle it wherever. But this is not a license for governments to print as much money as they want. Obviously, if they create way too much sand too quickly, it's going to spill out all over the place as dangerously high inflation that makes a mess of the economy. So the level of spending has to be sensible, and taxation does have to remove roughly the same amount as the spending added. But this is in order to prevent the sand from overflowing, to prevent inflation, as well as other policy objectives, rather than because of any sort of law of conservation of sand. Once counted, the removed sand actually sort of disappears rather than being used for later spending. And this is because money isn't a physical commodity. In the modern world, money is almost entirely a digital creature of double-entry bookkeeping. So money can be created or destroyed just by updating information in the databases of banks, in particular here, the central bank. But for this video, we're going to stick with the sand analogy. But we can imagine a simplified version of the government accounts up in the corner here. So we have a count of the new sand being spent into the economy and a count of the sand being taxed back out of the economy. If there's more spending than tax, then the difference is a deficit in red. Otherwise, it'll be a surplus in black. Now, if the economy is growing, that means the sandpit is getting larger, and then it actually needs a little more sand added than removed. So with a growing economy, the deficits can be larger without the risk of the extra sand spilling out into inflation. This, in a nutshell, is why advocates of MMT think the household budgeting analogy is not only technically wrong, but is also unhelpful. Because if your economy is growing and you scoop up more taxes than you spend, you run a surplus. You actually risk creating bare patches in your sandpit and causing the economy to shrink as you've effectively sucked money out of the economy. A growing sandpit needs more sand. But also, don't forget that while the sandpit growing does look way too much like an increasing physical footprint of the economy on the world, which of course we couldn't sustain long term, the scale of the economy is being measured in digital money, so we could, at least in theory, detach the growth in the economy from being an actual material growth in resource use, hopefully. These longer-term questions are extremely important, but I'll leave that discussion for another day. Going back to MMT, in some ways, the core message of MMT is to stop insisting blindly on the idea of balanced budgets, to stop focusing so much on deficits within the accounts, but to instead worry directly about inflation in the real economy. Yes, excessive spending can cause inflation, but there are other causes of inflation to worry about too. In the case of the recent rise in inflation after COVID, economists have highlighted various factors that were driving inflation at different moments. This graph from the National Bureau of Economic Research shows that energy price increases and supply chain shortages can explain a large amount of the inflation over this period. So it's disingenuous to take the simplistic view that all of the recent inflation spike was caused by the rise in deficit spending. Doubly so, given that inflation then came down despite continued large deficit spending. Inflation is a complex beast, but it is extremely important. Indeed, what many critics of MMT seem to almost willfully misunderstand is that just because MMT advocates are more relaxed about deficit spending, that doesn't mean that they are relaxed about inflation. Quite the opposite. MMT puts concerns about inflation as a central part of its analysis.
MMT is a framework for analysis, so we can help provide lawmakers with better sort of guidelines about how to operate the budget, how to think before you commit new spending. Why don't you take inflation risk into account before you commit to spending or cutting taxes or doing something else? Center inflation risk. That's what we want to see.
And of course, there are other important issues that MMT has views on too, like how to think about the total government debt and the sustainability of the interest payments on that debt. But I won't go into those here. But if you do want to learn a little more about MMT, I've actually done a summary of Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, that should be linked to above. But back to this video. So how does this all relate to universal basic income? To stretch my sandpit analogy a bit further, the problem of inequality in an economy can be understood as the sand within the sandpit accumulating into large piles that only a few children get to play with. One major concern with this latest wave of AI is that long before automation and robots replace all jobs for humans, it will massively increase inequality, piling the sand higher in some areas and leaving much of the playpit barren of any sand at all. So UBI is a bit like suggesting that we set up a sand sprinkler that just makes sure that there's always a minimum spreading of sand across the whole sandpit, so that everyone can have a little fun. Those who think about government finances in terms of the household budget analogy may worry that if we keep scooping sand from the big piles to feed the UBI sprinkler, then we'll soon destroy those piles, destroying the aspirational engine of the economy. It's fun to build with sand, but if your sandcastles keep getting knocked down, then you'll maybe stop building so much. Now, of course, advocates of UBI would no doubt say that the taxes don't need to be that high and punitive to run a genuinely basic UBI, fully funded through taxation. That may be, but the point of bringing MMT thinking into the picture is to note two things. Firstly, that we already know that some level of continuous deficit spending is possible within a growing economy without causing inflation. So some of that extra fiscal room could be used for the UBI. Secondly, we know that the government would simply create the sand for the UBI sprinkler. So the question isn't, how can we scoop up enough money? The only question is, how do we turn on the sprinkler without causing high inflation? The obvious mistake would be to set the UBI sprinkler to be adding so much new sand that inflation is just inevitable and the economy becomes a complete mess. But it seems very plausible to me that at a low enough rate of adding new sand from the UBI sprinkler, with a reasonable amount of additional spending from government, a reasonable level of taxation removing some sand, and a growing economy, then it should be possible to have an aspirational economy with, say, a monthly sprinkling of UBI, but without high inflation or crippling taxes. It would be a world where everyone gets some sand to play with, but if you want to build a big sandcastle, then you can still do the work to collect together some more sand to construct something interesting, without the sense that it'll just get knocked down immediately. Of course, this is all a bit hand-wavy, but I hope that through this analogy, I've given an intuitive sense of how MMT can shift the discussion about UBI away from asking, how are we going to pay for it, to instead be focused on how we can make sure the UBI doesn't cause high levels of inflation. Now, it's worth noting here that the origins of MMT are strongly connected to the idea of a job guarantee, not to UBI. But I'm seeing an increasing number of people talking about how the core ideas of MMT should be seen as policy neutral, and a growing interest in the ideas of MMT from those advocating for UBI. For example, in 2021, Scott Santens, a long-term UBI advocate, wrote a short book, Let There Be Money, exactly about how well these two ideas go together, saying, I've come to believe MMT may just be the key to achieving UBI, and perhaps even the only way. And I agree. So if, from an MMT perspective, the real question for UBI is how to control inflation, let's take a very brief look at this. Now, I'm not pretending that we already have the answers to this really hard problem, but I do want to point out some obvious ways in which simply taxing the money back out of the economy is not the only way to mitigate the risks of inflation from UBI. And indeed, the very rise in automation from this latest wave of AI tools may actually help us with this task. For example, one of the ways that UBI could put an inflationary pressure on the economy is by enabling people to stop doing certain low-paid jobs that they were only tolerating because they desperately needed the money. Indeed, for certain sectors, this could be a huge problem, as there simply won't be other people ready to step in to do these very low-paying, tough jobs. Obviously, these sectors will have to raise wages if they're going to attract anyone to continue to do these jobs. And in terms of the workers, this is great, and as it should be. But we can't deny that by itself, this would cause the cost of labour for those sectors to go up, and they'd almost certainly pass on at least some of these additional wage costs as price increases. If this is repeated across broad sectors of the economy, this will be experienced by everyone as inflation. Well, one obvious way to reduce this rise in labour costs for that sector is to have targeted investments that increases the amount of automation in that sector. This, to me, sounds like a great outcome, as it frees up people from doing these tough, low-paid jobs that they don't really enjoy, to instead, hopefully, find other, more useful, more fulfilling work, whether it is paid or not. Similarly, if the increase in aggregate demand from the UBI leads to supply-side bottlenecks, then there too, targeted investments to improve capacity and automation could potentially alleviate those supply bottlenecks that would otherwise cause inflation. And more broadly, I can think of two general mitigation strategies that might help reduce the risk of high inflation while introducing a UBI. The first is to introduce the UBI gradually, starting at an almost negligible level and then slowly increasing it over time. This way, the economy would not experience a potentially destabilizing step change at one moment in time, and any inflationary issues that do arise could be addressed before the level of UBI is raised further. Secondly, the political independence of central banks has been an important part of their ability to manage expectations around inflation, which seems to be a crucial component of managing the stability of a currency. In a similar way, I wonder whether it might be interesting to place the management of the UBI with the independent central bank, rather than it being at the whim of potentially populist politicians. This would not only help manage stable long-term expectations around the impact of UBI, but it could also give the central bank another lever to pull to manage inflation. If inflation is too high, simply reduce the UBI. If it is too low, then maybe increase the UBI. But they would have to first analyse carefully what is causing the inflation at that moment, like they did in this analysis I showed earlier, to determine whether or not UBI is the best lever to be pulling. And they should only ever make occasional, small adjustments to the UBI so that actual households can manage their budgets sensibly. With all of these decisions driven by transparent economic data rather than by politicians who may just be trying to win votes in the next election. Lastly, taxes clearly are still going to be an important part of how inflation is managed in an economy with UBI. But with one of the key goals being inflation management, this could shift which kinds of taxes are the most appropriate to be using. Analysis could be done to see which kinds of taxes are likely to reduce inflation the most for each dollar or pound taxed out of the economy. But, of course, taxes are also a tool to shape policy outcomes. And just to note, I am a big supporter of universal basic services like healthcare and education, as we have here in the UK. And, of course, for targeted benefits, such as to support people with disabilities. Hence why I kept this representation of government spending in this animation of the sandpit analogy of an economy with UBI. But obviously, different countries will end up with different approaches for how to organise and pay for these services, which will give valuable insights into what works best. But I hope here I've given a sense of how the ideas of MMT can shift the discussion about UBI away from how could we afford this towards how can we manage inflation if we do this? And given that many prominent voices seem to be convinced that one day we'll arrive at a political economy where AGI makes UBI a necessity,
Universal high income.
I think it's important that we try to work out how we could safely steer our political economy from here to there. And just to say, I've really enjoyed the discussions below my other videos. I try to get to as many comments as I can. So please do let me know what you think of the sandpit analogy I presented here, and indeed of making this link between MMT and UBI. And please do subscribe if you're interested to see more videos like this. Thank you for watching.